person than Annelise to bring here tonight. So Annelise Orleck, welcome, and thank you so much for coming.
Maggie, not only for inviting me, Gail for inviting me the first time back in April, but also for all the work that you all do that was so beautifully illustrated in that slideshow. Great. It works. Okay. These are terrifying times. These are in many ways sad times, and we inspire ourselves through this building of community, as you all well know. As an American historian, I teach about many other dark times in our history and frightening times in our history, in the era of slavery, the Native American genocide, and the Japanese internment, and the exploitation of labor. And in every one of those moments and places, the Friends have been there, and working to make the world a better place. And so I thank you for your inspiration. And I hope I can introduce you tonight to some people who will inspire you and give you a sense of the global dimension of the struggle, but also right here at home. This talk is based on a new book that I wrote that came out in late February called We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. And so I guess what I wanted to do is start by giving you a sense of what that means. And I'm going to move forward a little bit. I know Arnie wanted to do this for me, but I always run around. Okay. This project got its beginning in 2011 in New York City when I was part of a committee that was organizing the commemoration for the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Many of you are nodding. Are there those who don't know? Should I explain what that was? Very quickly, on March 25th, 1911, a modern garment factory building in Manhattan, which was also a New York University classroom building and still is, caught fire on the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors. And it was not unexpected. The workers had been warning that they were laboring under conditions that might one day kill them, and there were plenty of garment factory fires prior to that time. But this building was supposed to be fireproof. It was supposed to be modern. And 2 years earlier, when the largest women's strike in American history to that time was sparked in New York, it was known as the Uprising of the 20, 30, 40,000, and it was a mass uprising of young women, Jewish and Italian and Irish immigrant garment workers for safer, better conditions. When that strike was sparked, one of the shops that refused to sell was Triangle. They were the shirtwaist kings, right? They were the producers of the fancy, cutting-edge fashions of the moment. And they had their fireproof building, and they refused to be dictated to by labor. So they would not settle. And when the Triangle factory caught fire, it wasn't the first or the only fire or factory disaster, labor disaster that year in the United States. There were many. In fact, when U.S. entry into World War I began a few years later, more people died that year in labor accidents in the United States than died on the battlefield. So this was something that was not uncommon. A Triangle fire took place in the middle of Manhattan on a warm spring afternoon, and thousands watched as these young workers, many of them teenagers, most of them girls and women, were burned to death in a half hour, many of them jumping down to their deaths. And the horror of that in the middle of Manhattan on a warm spring afternoon literally seared the conscience of the nation. And so Triangle, every year thereafter, there'd be a memorial green in Washington Place in the middle of Manhattan, and some of the organizers from that era for as long as they lived, including Pauline Newman, a former Triangle worker I wrote about in my first book, Common Sense and a Little Fire, she would trudge over to that spot. And the narrative was always this. Those were the bad old days, before unions were strong, before we had labor legislation, and now things are better. Because that was a turning point. And it was. One of the witnesses of that fire, Frances Perkins, anyone heard of her? Okay. She went on to become the first woman cabinet secretary in American history, Franklin Roosevelt, Secretary of Labor. At that point, she was a social worker and an activist in a group called the National Consumers League, which couldn't exist now. The National Consumers League basically its members pledged that people shouldn't die to make their beautiful clothes. They were largely middle-class women and upper-class women, and that was their call to conscience. Well, when Perkins witnessed that fire, she vowed that she would devote the rest of her life to ensuring that there not be other disasters like this. And indeed, when she went on to be the chief advisor to Al Smith as governor of the state of New York, and then an advisor to the young assemblyman and later governor of New York and president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, that was her goal. Much of what we have in the way of protection, and if you're watching the news today, you know that some of this is very much under threat, Social Security in particular. Right? Much of what we have as a social safety net, we have Frances Perkins to thank for as an architect of the Social Security Act of 1935, as an architect of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. If the words, maximum hours, minimum wage, we don't have it in New Hampshire since 2011, but ironically, that's the year, the 100th anniversary of the Triangle Fire is the year New Hampshire got rid of the minimum wage. But if those words mean anything, overtime, the weekend, right? All of that comes from this aftermath. And, it wasn't obviously just Frances Perkins by any stretch. It was the workers who inspired her and the workers who continued to struggle and protest and fight. And when firemen were pulling the bodies out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory on that horrible afternoon in March 2011, they recognized some of them because they'd been the young girls who were activists in that strike to try to make things better 2 years earlier. They weren't just nameless victims. They were activists who had warned the city of what was to come. Well, on the 100th anniversary, those of us organizing, members of the Labor and Working Class History Association, unions, many others said, we can't in good conscience make this a narrative about the bad old days and how much better everything is now, because it's no longer true. Because we have gone backwards. And we've gone backwards a long way. And that's part of what the book that I am going to talk about tonight will give you a sense of. So we invited a lot of folks to speak at the 100th anniversary commemoration who do today's most dangerous jobs. Any idea what do you think? Today's most dangerous jobs. Thoughts? Shout out. Amazon is a very dangerous job.
Meat cutting.
What?
Meat cutting.
Meat cutting.
Factory farming.
What?
Factory farming.
Factory farming of all kinds. Absolutely.
Mining.
Mining always.
Construction.
Construction. Taxi driving. And garment work. So one of the people we invited to speak is this woman, Kalpona Actor. She was then 37, now in her early 40s. She's the leader, one of the leaders of an unbelievable movement by the women, and it's mostly women. There are some male workers in the 4 million who work in Bangladesh making clothing. But they are the people who make the clothing we wear today. When Kalpona got up to speak in New York that day, the first thing she did is she asked people to look at the label on the shirt, on your own clothes, or on the label of the shirt, jacket of the person sitting next to you. So you might want to do that. Take a look and see where your clothing is made. Anyone? Vietnam. Where? China? India? Jordan? What? Dublin. Fair trade, USA. Well, okay, here's the problem with the globalization of our world economy and the globalization of the garment trade. When Calpurnia Hector got up on stage in the Great Hall of the People reunion where that women's strike had begun in 1909, the first thing she said was, in Bangladesh, it's not 2011, it's 1911. And what she meant by that was that Bangladeshi garment workers hadn't experienced one fire, or 5 fires, or 10 fires. They'd experienced hundreds of them, making our clothes. And while we may look back at horror at the 146 workers who died in the Triangle Fire, you should know that until 2017, an average 200 garment workers were dying every year in Bangladesh making our clothes. Every year. And the worst disaster in the history of the garment industry was not the Triangle Fire, and it did not happen 100 years ago. It happened 2 years after the commemoration of the Triangle's centennial in Dhaka, in Rana Plaza, when an entire factory complex collapsed. Because the hunger for fast fashion, the global addiction for $5 and $10 shirts and pants and skirts that you could buy and buy again and buy again, that global addiction produced an unbelievable, come back, Alpona. Where'd she go? Oh no. Okay, now I need you, Ernie. Can we find it again? There we go, thank you, Calpona's back. That addiction produced an unbelievable growth in the number of people who work in the garment industry. At the beginning of the 21st century, there were 15 million people who worked in the garment industry. Between 15 and 20 globally. 20 million people. By 2015, it was 75 million. And most of them are women. So, clothing makers like Nike, which started a foundation called the Girl Effect, would like you to believe that this was a vastly liberating force for women around the world. And when I told that to Calpurnia, she started to laugh. And she talked about how in Vietnam, for example, the people who make Nike sneakers at most make 25% of what they need to live. In Dhaka, Bangladesh, it's 15%. Now, that's not only true of the rest of the world. One of the things that's happened is this globalization of our economy, of the garment industry, of agriculture, of the hotel trade, of all of these trades that we're talking about, have driven down wages and destroyed the protections of workers here. It's not accidental that New Hampshire got rid of the minimum wage in 2011. So by 2016, by the scary election of 2016, half of all American workers were making $30,000 or less. That's poverty wages. And so what I learned in writing this book is it's not just 1911 in Bangladesh. It's 1911 in London, it's 1911 in Concord, it's 1911 in Los Angeles. So don't be fooled if your clothing says made in the US. Unless it's got a union label or it's really a fair trade piece of clothing, the workers in this country are being exploited just as much. So what is the story of this book? So that was one moment that started this project, this idea that we've gone back 100 years. Think about that. We think about progress being slow. We've gone back 100 years. And then there's another issue. Where are we? Here we are. Okay. What does this mean? So 4 years later, I was visiting my daughter who was in college at that point in Florida, and I was really interested in the living wage movement in Tampa, which is very vibrant. Tampa, St. Petersburg area, a lot of activists. So I talked to some organizers and said, can we have a meeting? Got to get to interview a bunch of folks in this movement. Because by then I was just really getting into the research for this book. Just started in 2014, and I came into Teresita's Cuban Cafe in West Tampa. And I looked at activists around the table in the living wage movement. And there were fast food workers, and there were, actually the home health care workers had to Skype in because they were averaging in Florida, where there was also no minimum wage, 120 hours a week. And if you ask them, they were saying, you know what, these people that we care for are really fragile. We don't want to leave them without care. But as one woman said, for me, Fight for 15 is about feeling the sun on my face for 15-minute breaks a couple of times a day. Being able to just walk outside of the building. So they Skyped in. And then there were graduate students and college professors. And so I said to them, I'm an old labor historian, I've written many books about labor history. This is not your average, when you think of like working class solidarity, it's not what you think of. And this young man, Keegan Shepard, who was at the University of South Florida, talked about how many hours a week he worked for free. And how many hours a week every graduate student he knew there worked for free. They had spouses and children to support. They had to put a roof over their heads. But it was the argument is that, well, this is part of their education. He said, no, it's not. It's wage theft. And half of the labor at the university is done for free by graduate students. Then we had college professors, right? I am a dinosaur. I am the academic 1%. I am so damn lucky I can't even wrap my brain around it. In my adult life, the professoriate has become a poverty profession. 75% of teaching PhDs in this country are on course-to-course contracts. No job security, no minimum wage, no contributing to pensions, no health care. So one of those guys I met, a guy by the name of Cole Bellamy, brilliant man, tried to write as much as any other professor, tried to do right by his students. He taught 12 courses a year, that's 3 times what I teach. 12 courses a year, 3 different campuses that he has to travel to in 24/7 rush hour traffic. And he earned $30,000, just broke $30,000. His children were on Medicaid. That's the only way he could provide health benefits for his children. His family was on supplemental nutrition assistance, food stamps. And so, what Keegan said is they try to tell us that our advanced degrees make us special. And that if we just stay quiet and we don't complain, we'll get those tenure-track jobs. Right. We'll get to be hired full-time. He said, but that's just a lie to keep us quiet, because the truth is, we are all fast food workers now. So what did he mean by that? Because that's the second theme of the book. The first theme of the book is, this recognition that we've gone back 100 years in workers' rights and, what wages can buy, and their right to unionize, and safety conditions, and hours that they work. And the second is that we are all fast food workers now. One of the professors that I interviewed figured out how much he earned an hour for all the things he wasn't paid to do, because adjunct professors are not paid to advise students, and they're not paid to write letters of recommendation, and they're not paid to write lectures, and they're not paid to grade papers. They're paid based on this ridiculous notion that all they do is stand in a classroom, and that's the only labor they do that's worth payment. He said if you factored all that in, he figured he worked about $8.05 an hour. So when Keegan said we're all fast food workers now, this young man who was there that night in Teresita's, what's happening?
Just press the little X here on the right.
Get rid of that. Okay. This young man, blue Rainier, who was then 26, said, or maybe we're all adjunct professors. He said, but whatever, we are. He said, the American dream is broken. Because he and another really great young woman I met named Rika Mack had just come back from a training in Atlanta where 500 young fast food workers filled the church where Martin Luther King preached. And they were trained by 3 surviving activists from the 1968 Memphis sanitation worker strike, which Dr. King had gone to support where he was killed. And they came back and they said, we got the message. We are the new civil rights movement. And that the sanitation workers, trained them in civil disobedience, trained them, who said, in channeling their anger, be angry. Said, be angry, channel it. They trained them, they went down and they blocked some of the main thoroughfares in Atlanta in front of McDonald's, and we'll talk about McDonald's in a moment. Why McDonald's, second largest employer in the world. Not just in the United States, but in the world. Second largest private employer. First is Walmart. Yes. The only employer larger than Walmart are the US and Chinese militaries. McDonald's has the British National Health Service above it too. But these are the new colonialism, right? The new world powers, more powerful than most states, most nations, right? And so when these folks came back from Atlanta, which is where I met them in Teresitas, they said, we are standing on the shoulders of our grandparents. And we are very proud to stand on the shoulders of our grandparents. So on the 50th anniversary of the original Poor People's Movement, and as Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris are reviving the Poor People's Movement in New Hampshire and all over the country, I wanted to introduce you to some of the folks like Keegan Shepherd in his own way, and like Blue Rainier, who are carrying on that struggle. Now, one of the other themes of this book, so A, going 100 years back, B, the idea that suddenly nobody's an employee anymore. Right? If you think about it, you probably know it. Anytime someone tells you, oh, I got a job, it's great, I was looking for a job for so long, all the news is about how, we have no unemployment in the United States anymore. But what are these jobs, right? How is it that people can be working for so little money? My brother-in-law was so excited, he just finally got a job, he thought, for the Educational Testing Service. He's a tutor. And then it turned out, well, no, I don't actually work for the Educational Testing Service, I work for this labor contractor, right, who supplies labor for the Educational Testing Service. At Dartmouth, this insanely rich institution. All the people, it used to have union painters, right, who did all the painting and maintenance. Now everybody's a contractor. Dartmouth contracts with someone else, the unionized staff in the hotels, right? That is that we're all fast food workers. But then Blue made me realize, and that's another theme in this book, how linked many different kinds of social movements are. This is not simply a movement for a living wage, although that's part of it. It is a movement for racial justice. It is a movement for gender justice. The majority of the folks involved in this movement worldwide are women of color, young women of color, and they are moved to organize not just for a living wage, but against sexual violence. Me Too began with these workers that I interviewed in this project long before it began, on the part of some Hollywood, very famous women in Hollywood. And the McDonald's women walked out just last week in 10 cities across the United States to highlight the continued sexual assault and sexual violence on the job. And some of these folks I'm about to introduce you to walked out last November 25th around the world to demand an end to sexual violence on the job. And then you see Blue's shirt. This was April 2015. There was a march for a living wage in New York City, and a lot of these fast food workers, young African Americans especially, were wearing I Can't Breathe shirts. Anyone? I Can't Breathe? Eric Garner, right? At the time of the march, it had been just a year. since Eric Garner was murdered in Staten Island, from an immigrant family from Liberia, escaping violence, right, and coming to Staten Island to be murdered by the NYPD. And so you had that living wage campaign, and I said to Blue, how do you balance, these different movements that you're involved in? And he said, what do you mean, how do I balance? We're the same people. When we get off our third shift, which we have a third job, because we have to have 3 jobs because we can't afford to live on 1 job, we're the people who were harassed and beaten and shot at by police for walking home too late. So that's another major theme, the ways in which this whole movement is globally and in the United States brings together many, many, many different things. Led a movement that has gone on since 2010, really since 2006, in which hundreds of thousands, and I mean literally hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi workers are in the streets, protesting, shutting down cities, making vast human chains, a degree of civil disobedience that I know the Quakers know well, but just imagine it on this vast scale, and no coverage here. No coverage here. And so what was really interesting is that they realized you have to get to the consumers of the West, right, in order to get some attention. It was them who realized that they knew more about what happened at Triangle 100 years ago than they knew about what was happening in Bangladesh now, right? And so she began to talk about that here in this country. But she said, when I'm in Bangladesh, I said to people, your movement's going to win. Your movement's going to work. That's what Triangle means to us there. That it was a turning point. That it was a line in the sand, that it did begin to change things. And workers in Bangladesh in those last years have increased their wages from the late 1980s, when Kalpona started working, making our clothes at age 12, to now. They've raised their wages 35 times. Okay? The same is true of the Bangladeshi garment workers. The same is true of South African grape pickers. This was they earn the lowest wages in the world, so the increases are the most dramatic. But all over the world, workers are winning in these struggles. And that's something that's really helpful to know. So Blue, before the terrible things that have started to happen in Brazil happened, before the legislative coup that overthrew Dilma Rousseff, when Brazil was still run by the Workers' Party, McDonald's workers like Blue convinced the Brazilian Senate, the Human Rights Commission, the Federal Human Rights Commission in the summer of 2015, that McDonald's was destroying wages and working conditions for workers around the world. And so in an unprecedented event, the Brazilian Senate they invited workers from all over the world to come and talk about their experiences at McDonald's. And Blue was very surprised at age 26 when he got a letter from this Brazilian senator who was the chair of the Human Rights Commission, inviting him to come. And he came to Brasilia and was greeted by the workers there who had, convinced the government to do this. And he testified, and he said something amazing happened. What he's doing in this picture is he's showing you the burns on his arms. And when he got to Brasilia, he met this guy from Tokyo, a McDonald's worker. And he rolled up his sleeves. And Blue said, damn if you didn't have burns in exactly the same spots. And then he met a guy from Seoul, and he rolled up his sleeves, and he had burns in exactly the same spots. And then he met a man named Benedict Murillo, who I interviewed in Manila, and he rolled up his sleeves. That was a moment of galvanizing global working class solidarity. They understood that because all McDonald's workers work, all the franchises are forced to have exactly the same architecture and the same 90-second turnaround time for orders, and the grill and the deep fat fryers in the same place. And so he said, it sounds cheesy, but we called each other McBrothers, right? That is this new global solidarity. And so people ask, how in the world, the march that this picture was taken at, on that same day as there was that march in New York, there were marches in 250 American cities, 40 countries on 6 continents, where fast food workers walked off the job. That's an unimaginable organizing feat. How did they do it? How did they continue to do it year after year? And Blue said that's how, is the recognition through social media, right, using cell phones. Calpona said her workers don't have water. They don't have water to drink, but they all have cell phones, right? And so when the Cambodian garment workers increased their wages, she said, I saw people on the floor of the factory sitting there looking at videos of them celebrating the raise in their wage. So cell phones, the global corporations, all of this, and global popular culture is a way that they're able to organize around the world. By the way, when I was giving this talk at a Women in the Trades Conference, Women of Steel and Sisters of Iron in Milwaukee a few months ago, a guy came over to me and he rolled up his shirt and he showed me similar stripes on his back. And he said, you forgot to ask about how fast food workers get burned doing this, because the grill's right back there and you're trying to turn over the thing and you step back. He said if you had people roll up their shirts all over the world, they would be burned. Many of them in exactly that same place. So these are literally brands of the new labor slavery, the new wage labor. And those brands are part of what enables people to organize and rise above. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Unfortunately, my workers from the hotel industry, that picture for some reason wasn't coming up, but the hotel industry, fast food, it is happening around the world, and it is coinciding with the kind of anti-colonialism. Old anti-colonialism meets the new anti-colonialism against these global giants. This is Joanna's sister, Nice Carnation. Like Blue, she's not out of her 20s. She grew up in the vast slum in the middle of the mega city that is Manila, and under the conditions which approximately 1 billion people around the world live in, right? Below sea level, at a time of global warming, serious danger, right? In shacks and trying to hand cut these drains, into the earth outside of where they live so that they can make it. And part of that is because global agriculture drove millions and millions of people off their land since 2008. So we could plant all these GMO crops and create food safety by lying about who feeds us, and who feeds us is small farmers to this day. 70% of the food that we eat in the world is grown for us by small farmers, not by these mega corporations. Anyway, Sister Nice grew up there, and her mother, she said, I learned from my mother to fight for the rights even of squatters, even of people not in the traditional labor force, but in the informal economy. That's part of who I met around the world, people in the informal economy, people who sell whatever they can on the streets, right? People who do whatever they can to live. And she created a group called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. Now, if you think that has to do with Aretha Franklin, you're right. And that's one of the third forces that I want to talk about is global popular culture. And as a result of American colonialism, the Philippines loves 1970s American R&B. Everywhere you go, you will hear it, everywhere. And as one of the organizers of the Philippine workers said to me, he said, it's really weird, the Spanish were here for 500 years and we have some Spanish words in our Tagalog vocabulary, but basically in some architecture, he said that the Americans colonized our minds. And in so doing, it made many terrible things happen, but one of the interesting things is a very new kind of organizing, and that is an organizing using global popular culture in some extremely interesting ways. The RESPECT Fast Food Workers Alliance became a model for young workers around the world. And their protests were not carrying signs and doing the kind of regular protests that you think of. Again, respect is the word I found again and again. These are New York fast food workers. But they do singing, dancing, flash mobs. This is Lake Cadigan. He was 23 when I met him, musical theater student, reminded me of my son, who decided that he wanted to do something different than just appear in theater. He realized that in the informal economy of the Philippines, where half of all workers are under 30, and nobody is making enough living to support their families, people were dancing for money. And so I said, why not create a dancers union that can stage these protests in the middle of the city? And so that is exactly what they did. They called it Dubs, which was also an allusion to a popular kind of techno music, and it stands for the Dancers Union of Bagang Silangan, which is the neighborhood in Manila, which is famous for its great dancers. And they started using singing, dancing flash mobs as a form of protest. Now Manila, like many of the world's mega cities, especially in the global south, is so densely populated and has so few actual public transport vehicles. It's mostly cars and, tuk-tuks and jeepney buses, that it's impossible to get anywhere. I learned that when I was trying to interview people. I always say, well, meet me and I'll take you out. And, it's like, meet you? Nobody meets anybody in Manila. It takes 2-3 hours. Someone actually did come and meet me, and it took her 3 hours on 5 forms of public transport to get there. So they realized that everyone's stuck anyway, and so if they're stuck anyway, you might as well entertain them. So their first number was R-E-S-P-E-C-T. I'll tell you what it means to me, and they had a whole list of demands. They also performed to Katy Perry's Firework, right? Show your worth, right? Show your insight. And they pulled out the entire city of Manila's fast food workers in 2014 with a singing, dancing teenage girl conga line, singing their own made-up words to Let It Go from the Disney animated hit Frozen. Let it go, close the door, turn your back, McDonald's never bothered me anyway. So that's a piece of this that's been really fun, right? Is this really interesting popular culture, youth culture, social media movement that I think is really important because, some of you have obviously been in this business for a while, and you go to the March on Washington and, is there going to be any coverage? Will anyone know, right? In 1996, I was involved in these Have a Heart demonstrations at every state capital in the country right before the Welfare Reform, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act went into effect, ending welfare as we know it. And there was no coverage, right? There was no coverage. You don't need that now. You don't need it now. I stood at marches and I watched people upload their own footage, and I watched them get pictures. There was an amazing moment in the march in 2015 where I watched these workers, after they'd uploaded their own video, pull down and show an image of a Bangladeshi garment worker with a sign that said, we support, she took a selfie, said, we support American fast food workers, 5 for 15. Right? And so there's a very different ability to communicate now, and that has to do with organizing, but also publicizing their events. So, one of the criticisms of this movement is that it doesn't bring people into unions. Right? That it's a great movement, but it doesn't bring people into unions. In the end, you can't have worker power without having union power. I learned that that is not true. And this is Prince Jackson and Canute Drayton from New York City. And what they talked about is they're part of a really important leading edge of growing unions in the United States right now, which is in airports. In the fall of 2016, they successfully organized a union of 8,000 airport workers in Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark airports. And one of the reasons that was, and you also got workers unionizing in LAX, which they've been trying to do for 20 years, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. Right? 3 weeks after the 2016 election, they had to slow down in Logan, right? Where you couldn't move through Logan Airport without seeing them. One of the important things about their coming into unions is that airports have 1 million of these subcontractors. Well, you don't work for the Metropolitan Transit Authority, you work for, this souvenir store, or you work piercing ears for this store. There are 1 million different contractors. They proved that even in this new economy where everyone's a contract worker, you could organize. I said to them, what was your inspiration? They said, the fast food workers, because they're in our family, right? They're our relatives. They're our kids. They're the ones who made the country and the world see that we need a living wage. Because one of the issues that's really hard in this movement is that in this era where clothing, all this wonderful, colorful clothing, and you have berries 12 months a year, right? Remember when berries were a summer treat? Right? And you would just get them? Now it's berries 12 months a year. How did that happen? Do we stop and think about it? We need to stop and think about it, right? We need to think about why, clothing costs less than it did when you were young, right? And why it disappears faster than you could possibly imagine because it's meant to go under. So all of these actions have been intended to create visibility. The women of the Pico Rivera, California Walmart, who staged the first strike against the Walmart on American soil in October 2012. There they are. I see you guys are badass, strike a badass pose, and they did. These photographs, by the way, are taken by my wonderful friend and many-time collaborator, Liz Cook. And one of the things we wanted to do in this book is not only tell this story through the eyes of workers, because these names, these words about globalization and austerity and contractualization and the gig economy, it's all abstract until you meet real people. And so this book is told very much through their words, and Liz's photographs can enable you to see them. So Denise and Venanzi and the women of the Pico Rivera, California Walmart reached their limit when it came to respect in 2012. And I interviewed one of their colleagues and mentors, Evelyn Cruz, who escaped the Salvadoran Civil War to move to Southern California. And so she was not afraid of a whole lot. And she said it really wasn't wages in the end that took me out. It was the disrespect and abuse of my fellow workers on the floor. And she said, Walmart talks about family, and she said they engaged in what she called predatory hiring, by which she meant they hired people who couldn't afford to fight back. They got themselves a grant for welfare to work. They hired people coming out of prison. They hired injured vets. They hired single mothers. And she said then every morning they'd have a meeting where they'd let us know how little we were worth. That's how the day started every day, and how replaceable we are. And she said, I watched grown people, grown women mostly, be yelled at by managers in front of customers, called stupid, called incompetent. She said, I got madder and madder. And then I saw my coworker who came in, she was dissolved in tears. Her daughter was dying of cancer. And her shift supervisor would not give her time off to be with her daughter, to take care of her daughter. And then she said, I don't care. So that song that Judy sang at the beginning, I heard that over and over and over again from these workers who launched these incredible strikes with nothing to lose. So these folks did have something to lose. They ultimately lost their job, but first they started a revolution. Right? That first strike in front of a Walmart on Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of the year, the day after Thanksgiving in 2012, that was then echoed by the fast food workers in New York and then spread around the world. When fast food workers tried to organize in other countries, they were shocked. They didn't expect there to be as much support as there was. But it's global and everybody's feeling it, and respect and dignity are the words that I heard again and again and again. Now those folks lost their jobs because Walmart would either close the store or lay people off. That's how Walmart does it. But if you talk to Denise and Venanzi, they've been arrested, they've lost their jobs. For some people, it has been even worse. Denise and Venanzi both have union relatives. Jenny Mills has been living, that is her home. When I interviewed her, she'd been living in that car for 2 years. And she said, screw you, Walmart, I'm parking that car right in front of Walmart. And she did. And the workers, the fast food workers at Denny's, gave her a bathroom and food every morning. And she was still on strike. She said, I wouldn't change it. I have no regrets. The cost is high for these workers. The benefits, they've started to win in many ways. And I want to close, I want to give you one more group of people and then close, because I'm supposed to be done in 5 minutes. Close with some positive examples of how this movement has made things better. Okay, so there's one more group that I want to talk about. These are our Cambodian workers, and I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about them, but they have been amazing. And the one thing that I want to do before, I want to talk about this other group, but you see that scar on Chamonix's forehead? Every Cambodian garment worker organizer I met had that scar, including the leading woman organizer, Sapor Yang, who you may meet because she tours the United States trying to raise consciousness about the conditions under which Nike shoes are made, and she shut down the main Nike store in Chicago last year. Anyway, Sapor Yang she kind of came up on a motorcycle, pulled off her helmet, she had that. And that scar is reserved for successful union organizers after they win the contract, right? Because it's nominally a communist country, it's supposed to be a worker state. After they win, they come out and they're beaten. And this is how they recognize each other. It's like the scars on Blue's arm, right? They're literal physical embodiments of the class struggle, of the struggle for liberation, for decency. So the Cambodian struggle continues, the Philippine struggle continues, under Duterte, under Hun Sen. You know, after the 2016 election, when I was curled up in fetal position, depressed, I thought about these folks, right? And I knew that if they can do it, we can do it. There we have one little piece, because these people are beautiful, back to popular culture. I'm going to go fast, but these are young women who create a different kind of union movement. It's not attached to any of the unions. It's a feminist struggle. They work for a group called United Sisterhood Alliance, and United Sisterhood Alliance organizes garment workers and sex workers, because what happens when factories close and workers go to Bangladesh or someplace where it's cheaper is these women who've been forced off their farmlands and moved to the cities to become garment workers don't necessarily have a way to support themselves. So they decided that you want to remove the stigma between good garment workers and bad girl sex workers and recognize that it's part of the same economy. They did some very, very interesting things. In January 2014, Cambodia banned protests by workers because they were getting so big, and some of those leaders were calling for the Hun Sen dictatorship to come to an end and have a democratic election. So what do you do if you can't make a protest? Tarat Sok organized fashion shows called Beautiful Clothes, Ugly Reality, where workers would come out wearing the clothes they made but couldn't afford to buy, and they would carry signs, and singing, dancing, and again, the American popular song Sarah Bareilles' Little Black Dress, and they would carry signs that showed what they earned and the annual profit of the companies for the clothes they made. And again, the police looked at it and was just, that is not a demonstration, it's a fashion show, you can't shut us down. Funem started a girl group, Messenger Band. And Messenger Band sings the words that are given to them by garment workers, and they travel around the country organizing, singing, organizing role-playing, and it's quite remarkable. I just think she also is all of 26, started working at 16, and coming face to face with Hun Sen soldiers who'd say to her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "You know, I'm just a singer in a rock and roll band, really, there's nothing dangerous." Right? 1 in 4 American grocery dollars is spent in Walmart, and berries are what made Walmart rich. The global berry monopoly, Driscoll's, has taken over berry growing year-round. That's why you have these nice bioengineered plastic clamshell berries in your store year-round instead of local berries that you used to freeze or do whatever, you know, so that you use them in season. And these are the folks who drove it. So Arsenio Lopez, Anastasia Lopez is his mother. Oaxacan farmers driven off their land by NAFTA and the flooding of Mexico with cheap American corn, cheap bioengineered corn that destroyed many of the wild varieties. There was something like 2,000 varieties of corn. Her father was a bracero. Her husband crossed the border and lived in underground holes, all to get the berry industry going, all the various Driscoll's sharecropping operations. Arsenio has organized today's workers. All of them are Mixteco, all of them are indigenous. Their vision of transnational revolution is very different. The chapter about Arsenio is called "These Borders Are Not Our Borders." which is what Arsenio said. He's fighting. We organized a group called the Mixteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project, and Mixteco and Zapoteco and Truqui and other indigenous Oaxacan workers are picking berries from Baja California to British Columbia. And he said, we are transnational. Your borders mean nothing to us. This idea, and I think as you know, this is a great place to close. We're in the ladies, good. As the caravan, right? Supposedly the election in 3 weeks is going to be about the caravan. As that caravan heads to the American border, understand they farmed their land in the mountains of Oaxaca. That family had that farm for 300 years. They lost that farm after NAFTA made it impossible for them to stay on it. Right? They subsidized the farm by coming over here to help, the American berry industry grow. But the borders are not our borders. As Arsenio said, he said, I think any indigenous person should have citizenship in all 3 countries. Right? These borders are not our borders. And so they have organized from Baja California in spring 2015. Did anyone follow the berry strike? Anyone notice? 50,000 workers walked out of the fields, laid down on the Pan-American Highway that carries berries into the United States, made Walmart and Whole Foods say ouch. Enough that they then went and negotiated for these workers. They doubled their wages. Same with the big blueberry farms, Sakuma Berry in Washington State. So very quickly, these folks are winning. It's not easy, the price is high, they suffer stuff that I can't even imagine. But wages are doubling and tripling in 10 times. In the United States between 2012 and 2016, through protest, through local legislation, through state legislation, through convincing corporations, pressuring corporations to raise wages, American workers gave themselves 12 times the amount in raises that Congress gave them when they raised their wages last in 2007, when they raised the minimum wage. In Bangladesh, as a result of something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Building Safety Accord, which got 225 global clothing corporations to sign an agreement that they would allow worker-chosen people to inspect these factories for unsafe conditions, and they would pay to have them repaired, or they would be sued in their own country. In 2017, Kalpana Ekter will tell you 0 workers died making our clothes in Bangladesh. And in Vermont, last night, Migrant Justice celebrated the 1-year anniversary of Milk with Dignity. Right? They finally got Ben & Jerry's to live up to their name, as a socially conscious corporation and ensure, that farms, the thing about the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, the thing about the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the Tomato Growers Fair Food Program, the thing about Milk with Dignity is it knows that the farmer, the factory owner doesn't necessarily have much of a profit, or any at all, right? It's the big corporations that can afford to pay more and that can bring change, and they have brought change. So I want to leave you on a positive note. It's a tough story. There's a lot of really sad things, a lot of high costs, terrible costs are being paid by the workers in this struggle, but they're winning and they're not stopping. 24-year-old Emma Tienza, one of those Philippine singing, dancing protesters. I wrote her after the Duterte regime took over a democratic election. And I said, I'm scared for you guys. How can you keep on doing this? And she said, you can give me 1,000 reasons to leave the movement, and I'll give you 1,000,000 why I never will. The movement is my music, it's my rhythm, it's my life. So, thank you.